Welcome everyone, I'm your host Emerson Green. So I think it's incumbent on panpsychists to explain why their view typically strikes people as counterintuitive. It is the main problem for panpsychism, whether or not it's recognized as such. There's sort of a default presumption against panpsychism that's mostly due to its weirdness. Of course, it's weird is not a good argument, but I think there's no denying that panpsychism is starting off at a major disadvantage because of its weirdness. I myself am torn between panpsychism and dualism, broadly construed, and I'm most tempted by dualism when the counterintuitiveness of panpsychism makes itself apparent, when I'm aware of how divorced the panpsychist view of nature seems from my ordinary life and ordinary interactions with the world. The more weight I afford to common sense and my intuitive, pre-reflective picture of the world, the less attractive panpsychism seems. Obviously, I'm not naturally inclined to attribute consciousness to any cluster of physical activity that doesn't at least resemble an animal in its general form and its behavior. I think there are essentially three main reasons most people come to the table biased against panpsychism. First, I think our theory of mind is only triggered under specific conditions. But it's not phenomenal consciousness per se that triggers our theory of mind, causing us to attribute consciousness to others. What does activate our mind attribution is typically associated with phenomenal consciousness, but not always. Even assuming panpsychism is true, evolution would still have endowed us with faculties that are highly discriminatory when it comes to mind attribution, and we'll be diving more into that in a moment. So I almost didn't include this second reason, but I suppose I should mention one minor confusion that can contribute to the perceived implausibility of panpsychism. If it needs to be said, panpsychism does not entail that everything is conscious. Panpsychists typically don't think that anything you can name, drapes, mangoes, a tumbleweed, is a genuine subject of experience. It would take panpsychism plus other views, like mereological universalism or unrestricted composition, to get the result that everything is conscious. But as far as I know, most panpsychists don't think everything is conscious. So how is that? Well, you could rightly say that my index finger is associated with experience or experience involving, but it doesn't follow that my index finger is a subject of experience. You could rightly say that a football team or a group of people is associated with experience or experience involving, but it doesn't follow that the group forms a subject of experience. If you've thought about panpsychism before, that doesn't need to be said, but I thought I'd be safe and mention it. The third major reason is how we're naturally inclined to think about consciousness, and this could be divided into two parts. So it takes a little effort to conceptually separate phenomenal consciousness from the myriad of activity that occurs in the mind. Panpsychists think consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, but we often have to clarify that what we mean by consciousness involves a fairly short list of very basic features of the mind. On panpsychism, human consciousness is a rare form of consciousness in the universe. It would indeed seem very implausible and unmotivated to attribute something like human minds to non-humans or animal minds to non-animals. The second reason within this subcategory has to do with how we conceptualize what consciousness is in a different sense. According to psychologist Paul Bloom, we are natural-born dualists. We're highly disposed to think of the mind and the body as two separate entities. And according to physicalist David Papineau, even a lot of physicalists haven't fully shaken off their default dualist programming. In fact, he thinks this is one of the major reasons physicalists find panpsychism counterintuitive. If they could just stop thinking like dualists, and more like physicalists, they wouldn't find panpsychism so counterintuitive.
Let me say a little bit about my own attitude to panpsychism. So, as I said, I'm quite sympathetic, and I have a couple of reasons for this. One is that you said, and I think that's right, many people think it's kind of ridiculous, isn't it, that I don't know, bees and worms and stones should be in any sense conscious. I worry that one of the reasons they think it's ridiculous is because they're thinking of consciousness in a dualist way. They think there's all the physical stuff, and then in addition, there's the mind stuff. I mean, I said earlier that while I'm a physicalist, I think a kind of issue here is that physicalism is deeply counterintuitive. It's very hard for people to embrace physicalism intellectually. And there's something, we didn't go into it, but there's all kinds of pressures that push us intuitively towards dualism. I don't think there's anything, I think there's an argument there. I don't think there's anything wrong with physicalism. There's something wrong with people that they can't embrace physicalism. But the result of that is they intuitively think dualistically. So they think in addition to all the physical stuff at certain places in the universe, there's extra, the puffs of smoke. The feelings are generated by certain kinds of complex physical systems, particularly brains. And once you've got that view, then it's very natural to think, well, the special stuff is going to arise here and there, but the idea that it arises everywhere, that looks completely unmotivated and ridiculous. So I think part of the reason for finding panpsychism so strange is the fact that most people have never really freed themselves from dualist thinking, which you and I both agree they should. Now, once you do free yourself from dualist thinking, you think that there's just the physical stuff, there's just physical stuff all over, then the idea that there should be a line somewhere in the physical stuff on the one side of which you have consciousness and the other side of which you don't starts to seem rather unmotivated.
Through the unforgiving history of evolution, humans have developed cognitive faculties that aid in our navigation of the environment. I'm naturally inclined or disposed to form a host of beliefs about other minds, the external world, and mundane facts that we typically don't think about too often. We actually are amazing creatures. It's impressive that we human beings get the right answers to so many questions, and it makes sense that we have generally reliable cognitive faculties. If we didn't, the odds are overwhelmingly that we would be selected against. Natural selection is ruthless, and any organism like us that was hopelessly confused and unable to form a generally truth-tracking picture of the world it needs to navigate would probably get taken out of the gene pool. We have default settings, as it were, like an intuitive physics, which accurately guides us through the world of middle-sized objects in our immediate environment. We're really good at knowing how physical things behave at this scale. Not so much in the realms of the very small or the very large, or unimaginably long or short timescales, but we do successfully form true beliefs about the parts of the physical world most relevant to our survival and reproduction. You don't need to understand quarks to pass on your genes. You do need to be able to respond accordingly to this middle-sized stuff around you. A lot of that middle-sized stuff around you isn't just inanimate matter, it's alive. And some of these living things around you have a rich inner mental life and a complex psychology. So for evolutionary success, you also need default settings when it comes to understanding these things as well. You'll need an intuitive psychology, along with your intuitive physics. I'm not saying you come pre-programmed with beliefs about these subjects exactly, but you at least come with the capacity to develop or acquire an intuitive physics, psychology, biology, and so on. For example, you were not born with the English language encoded into your DNA or downloaded onto your brain, but you do have the capacity to learn language, while chimps and cats and oak trees do not have that capacity. They cannot acquire language from their environment. But regardless of how it works exactly, humans somehow end up with general default settings when it comes to our common sense physics and common sense psychology, and evolution clearly played a major part in shaping how we see the world. You're not a blank slate, and natural selection can help us explain human nature. So if you're interested in apologetics and philosophy of religion, you've probably heard of hyperactive or hypersensitive agency detection. According to psychologist Justin Barrett, this is the tendency to attribute agency and intentionality where it does not exist or is unlikely to exist. So here's a famous example. Imagine you're on the plains of Africa 10,000 years ago and you hear a rustle in the grass. It could be a predator, or it could be the wind or something totally innocuous. The evolutionary advantage of getting the answer right is obvious, but let's think about what happens if you're wrong. Say you assume it's nothing, but it's actually a predator. That's a false negative, and now you've been removed from the gene pool. But let's say you assume it's a predator, and it turns out to be nothing. That's a false positive, and it didn't really cost you anything. False positives are a lot less costly than false negatives. So the thinking goes that natural selection favors false positives over false negatives when it comes to agency detection. We're all descended from those who heard a rustle in the grass and either ran away or prepared to fight. And we're not the only ones. If you're sitting by the fireplace with your dog on a snowy evening and some snow falls off the roof and collides with the ground, oftentimes the dog will start barking or start growling or at least start paying attention to potential danger, since the same evolutionary pressures were active in his biological history too. So in psychology, theory of mind refers to the capacity to understand the minds of others, their beliefs, thoughts, desires, intentions, and emotions. Other animals need a theory of mind as well. Is this creature a threat to me? How does it feel? Does it want to eat me? Is it angry? And human beings, since we navigate a complex social environment, we require a far more advanced theory of mind. Theory of mind involves something a lot more basic as well, attributing consciousness to some objects, but not others. Detecting a mind in the first place is step one, and this capacity of ours misfires all the time, probably because of the evolutionary pressure to favor false positives over false negatives. Like, have you ever heard a bump in the night and were unable to suppress the thought that maybe it's someone and not something? So false positives get all the press because A, it's the kind of error favored by natural selection, and B, it could play some role in the formation of supernatural beliefs. Our natural inclination to over-attribute agency to natural events and see minds where there are none strikes a lot of non-believers as fairly suggestive. But what about false negatives? Do those ever occur? Well, yeah, they occur all the time. We fail to detect agency where there is agency. We sometimes fail to detect a mind where there is a mind. For example, some animals have excellent camouflage. Even animals who don't put a lot of eggs in the camouflage basket still often blend in with their surroundings. Especially if you're not looking hard for them, it is very easy to walk right by an animal and commit a false negative. In another vein, think about newborn babies. These days, most people accept that babies are sentient and can feel pain, but that was not always the case. As Jonathan Birch notes, quote, "In the 1980s, it was still apparently common to perform surgery on newborn babies without anesthetic on both sides of the Atlantic. This led to appalling cases and to public outcry, and the campaigns to change clinical practice. People don't need convincing anymore that we should take newborn human babies seriously as sentience candidates, but it's a useful cautionary tale because it shows you how deep that overconfidence can run and how problematic it can be. It just underlines the point that overconfidence about sentience is everywhere and is dangerous." Birch also notes cases of coma patients who were apparently conscious for at least parts of their coma, completely unbeknownst to the medical professionals working on them. False negatives do occur, and the consequences can be horrifying. Famously, Descartes argued that non-human animals were automata. They didn't have feelings or experiences, so one could do whatever they liked to these real-life philosophical zombies without worrying about causing any pain or suffering. And today there are still some complete fucking idiots who hold to a view like this. Descartes held not just that humans are conscious, but only humans are conscious. Supposedly, a follower of Descartes once kicked a pregnant dog, and when his companions berated him, he replied that the dog's cries were only like the rattling of gears. So I don't think that Descartes and his followers were naturally disposed to think that dogs couldn't feel pain. I think it was rather the product of bad theorizing about consciousness. False negatives can have a variety of causes. So here's where the metaphysics of consciousness enters into the picture. Materialism and dualism have something interesting in common: their general understanding of matter. The materialist and the dualist both reject views like Russellian Panpsychism, which holds that the intrinsic nature of the physical itself is mental. The materialist/dualist view of matter, that it either has no intrinsic nature or that its intrinsic nature is non-mental in character, is plausibly a product of our default human wiring. We have a set of inclinations, dispositions, and psychological tendencies to form certain beliefs and to attribute mind to certain configurations of matter, but not others. Your theory of mind is subject to both false positives and false negatives. It misfires. And additionally, in the past, we have theorized our way into thinking that newborns and animals can't feel pain. Coma patients have woken up and reported being conscious during the coma. The reason panpsychism is so counterintuitive is because our natural default settings, our intuitive physics and our intuitive psychology, strongly dispose us to only attribute minds in certain cases involving complex behavior. We are highly discriminatory in our attribution of consciousness. Erwin Schrödinger once defined life as a physical process that continues on long after it should have stopped. I think there's something very similar at work with conscious life specifically.
And I'm not going to get the exact quote here, but roughly speaking, what Schrödinger says is that life is a physical process that continues on long after it should have stopped. Now, that's a contentious kind of definition to give, because what do you mean should have stopped? After all, the Earth goes around the sun for millions and billions of years. It never stops. Like, how do you know when something's going to stop? But what Schrödinger is trying to do is to distinguish between something like a ball rolling down a hill, which is an open system. The ball can bounce, it can emit noises, there is friction, et cetera, and the ball will generally roll down, or a rock or whatever, roll down to the bottom of the hill and stop. It will not pick itself up and climb back up the hill. Whereas a living being, when you feed it, when you give it the stuff it needs from the outside world, can keep going. A person, unlike a rock or a boulder, can not only go down the hill, but then back up and then down and then back up again. And not in a simple way. It's by taking in free energy from our environment. That's why in Schrödinger's book, he talks a lot about entropy and free energy.
I think there's something very similar at work with conscious life specifically. What triggers our theory of mind, so to speak, is the observation of certain forms and behaviors that naturally lead us to apply psychological concepts. We're highly discriminatory when it comes to using that language, or at least when it comes to using that language and taking it seriously. But what does that have to do with phenomenal consciousness exactly? Is it true that anything phenomenally conscious is also going to be a case where it's appropriate to apply psychological concepts? Well, no. Conceptually, it's very easy to separate out complex psychology from what its likeness. It can be like something to exist without any accompanying complex psychology, and you could also imagine a philosophical zombie, or a complex AI that has something resembling complex psychology but isn't phenomenally conscious. Conceptually, it's very easy to separate out what its likeness from the kind of thing natural selection is sensitive to, the kind of thing that it actually cares about, that's actually relevant to your survival and reproduction. I think this is helpful in understanding why we are inclined to attribute consciousness to things like monkeys and cats, but not really houseplants. You don't really need to invoke psychological or mental concepts to explain the behavior of plants. Sometimes people do, even if they don't take it seriously or literally. I mean, people also do it with chemistry. Mentalistic language slips into our causal language all the time. But it's really only when physical activity becomes so complex, when it continues moving long after it should have stopped, that we start to apply mental concepts and actually take it seriously. We don't just care whether it's like something to be a tiger. We care about its complex psychological states. That's what has evolutionary relevance. That's what natural selection is sensitive to. Not the mere presence of some bare kind of sentience. Why and how would natural selection be sensitive to the presence or absence of phenomenal consciousness? Complex psychological states have obvious evolutionary relevance, but just the mere presence or absence of what its likeness, it's hard to see A, how natural selection even could be sensitive to that, and B, why it would be sensitive to it. And it might be helpful to think about one of the most common confusions regarding panpsychism here. Panpsychists think consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, but we often have to clarify what we mean by consciousness, which just involves a fairly short list of very basic features of the mind. We often have to clarify that we're talking about phenomenal consciousness, and not the rich and complicated inner lives of adult human beings, or even that of a newborn. Say there is an intrinsic nature of matter, and say that it is mental in character. How would that have influenced evolutionary history? How would that change our default psychological profile? Well, it wouldn't. We would still have exactly the same set of biases. What are we really sensitive to here? What is relevant to natural selection? The fact that it's like something to be? Or is it something completely different that's typically associated with phenomenal consciousness? I think it's easy to see how we could be systematically in error when it comes to the attribution of consciousness here. We know that we can make these kinds of errors, false negatives, as the consequence of a variety of causes. Assuming panpsychism is true, something like this would have to be the case. We'd have to be systematically in error. And I think that's not only possible, I think that if we live in a world where panpsychism is true, it's hard to see how evolutionary history would have gone any differently. We still would have needed some kind of line between animate and inanimate matter, and psychologically complex forms of life, and forms of life so simple that our theory of mind just isn't even triggered in the first place. Evolutionary history is largely responsible for the counterintuitiveness of panpsychism, and it's from these natural tendencies, inclinations, and dispositions that we theorize our way further into reifying our overconfidence about the lack of sentience in most of the natural world. My only aim here is to describe why I think panpsychism is counterintuitive. It's not to motivate the view with arguments. I'm only explaining why panpsychism conflicts with our pre-reflective image of the world. We do form accurate beliefs about the external world and other minds, but natural selection doesn't care whether or not there is phenomenal consciousness associated with simpler forms of physical activity. We attribute minds to things when it would be otherwise hard to explain their behavior. But this is not the same thing as being gifted with a phenomenal consciousness detector. Not at all. Whether or not Russellian panpsychism is true, we would have ended up with the same set of intuitions about mind attribution. Whether or not the intrinsic nature of physical activity is experiential, we would have ended up with the same highly discriminatory mind attribution module. The reason you feel that panpsychism is counterintuitive is because of inbuilt psychological tendencies that you have no reason to trust on the matter. It's our default human psychology that causes us to come to the table already biased against it. So this is why I take panpsychism so much more seriously than others. If you just evaluate it on its merits, it has quite a lot going for it, and not a lot going against it. It's the presumption of guilt that keeps people from seeing this, the inbuilt incredulity that is the product of fallible cognitive faculties that we already know make exactly the type of error that would lead us to think panpsychism is counterintuitive. Exactly the type of error we would still expect to see even if panpsychism is true. So when you look at panpsychism without the priors weighing insanely against it, it seems like a plausible alternative to the traditional views. It has some of the advantages of physicalism and a physicalist ontology, and some of the advantages of dualism, without either of their alleged problems. But again, it's not my aim to motivate panpsychism today, just to create the conditions where you can actually see the motivations. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll see you next time.